Good afternoon, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us at Platform Talk at Art Toronto. My name's Emily Butler, I'm the curator of the Talks program. Before we start, I wanted to acknowledge that the Art Toronto Talks program takes place on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. And it is now the home to many diverse First Nations, including Inuit and Métis peoples. As a newcomer to Canada, I wish to contribute towards truth and reconciliation, and I understand that one of the first steps towards this is a process of learning or relearning. And I hope that the Talks program is a chance to learn together, to look towards the future in this kind of tricky socio-political times, and to reflect together on how we can build a better, more resilient and representative art world. And I'm really thrilled that we're joined today by two experts who are going to share their experience of navigating the art world. I'm really thrilled that we're joined by Dr. Paul Marks, who's the Associate Professor of Surgery at the University of Toronto and Medical Director, Head Orthopedic Surgeon at the Toronto Raptors. And he will be talking about his long-standing support of the contemporary art scene and his collecting practice. He will be in discussion with Tash Perrin, who's the Deputy Chairman of Christie's New York. Thank you so much for being with us today at Art Toronto. So there'll be a chance to ask some questions at the end of the discussion. And before I hand over to Paul and Tash, please do join me in giving our speakers a very warm round of applause and enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be home in Toronto. I work in New York, but come home very often, and it's an extreme pleasure to be able to have a conversation with you today. You've been you're a well-known collector, known to us at Christie's and known to many different wonderful galleries and directors here and museums across the board. You've got some phenomenal relationships that you've been able to develop. And I thought that what we would do is start with a couple of slides. And I know this is going to be very difficult for us to get enough time today to finish all the discussions that we started, but I'm hoping that we can get through a fair amount of them. So thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you.
So good. So a couple of slides to begin with. This is your library at home in Toronto. And you have you've discussed openly about the fact that you read voraciously. Do you want to tell a little bit about the fundamentals of your library and how that's been so important to you?
Certainly. Someone told me yesterday there might not be very many people here, but I said I'm used to talking to myself, so it's like, so thank you for coming. The library, for me, is really a central hub. It's the nerve center, if you will. And at the university, I do a lot of research, I do teaching. And I always feel that to have the manuscripts for a certain artist or a time in art, it can be very educational. And if I give a work to a museum, I try to give some of those books to the museum at the same time, so that they would have them in their library collection, and if they're curators or art students and so forth, that they would have the references. I started off very classically in art because I thought at the beginning that you would collect Picasso and Matisse etchings, which is art. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people who, after a certain arbitrary date, might say, well, that's not very good art. And there's other people in the contemporary world that think something is quite great, but they don't have the historic background and say, well, that's not new. Someone did that 75 years ago. You just have to read about it. And so the library is really important, as I said, for reading. My wife, who's a pediatrician, Shauna, we have 5 kids. She's very knowledgeable, but she's maybe less interested, I tell people. And if I'm reading a book, sometimes she'll say, dead or alive, which I've always sort of thought is a very interesting way to demarcate or sort of stratify out art. And I'll say, no, this person's gone, but the art is still very vibrant, and it's resonating, and it's impactful. and it's important by some standard. And then I might say, well, this artist, the paint's still wet, but it kind of smells a bit funny already. So I think it's always important to have a historic context, and the library is that keystone for me. It's the grounding. And I know everything goes digital, and I did my undergraduate in computer science and numbers theory and mathematics, but I still think there's something quite great about holding a book and looking through. And sometimes what I would do is I'd go through some of what they call catalog resumes of an artist, and I put Post-its for things that I really liked. And I'd sit down with some mentors or teachers and curators and knowledgeable people, and they could tell me why that was a good choice or a bad choice. And but at the end of the day, as we'll probably talk, it's always what impacts you when you're standing in front of something and you go, I don't know why, but I really love that. And we just walked in here, I didn't know, but this artist over here on the wall is a young artist from Hamilton, Ontario, Kareem Anthony Ferrara. I think his family's originally from Trinidad. And I think he's a spectacular painter. I walked in and I saw this work at a Toronto gallery. They're out here. And I go, wow. And sometimes that's all you need. You have to trust, I say you have to trust your gut. And that's just an example of someone. I didn't know that was going to be hanging until we just walked in here 10 minutes ago.
You were surprised to have it right there.
And not that it would be any badge of honor, let's say, but the gallerist sent me an article in Vanity Fair, and he had a gallery in Los Angeles, and I guess an art advisor bought a painting of his for LeBron James' dining room. So there's hanging in this article in Vanity Fair, but I didn't know that. But again, I think it's just whatever impacts you as an individual. I think it'd be quite fulfilling.
So you talk a little more on that later, because I think that there's a lot that we can unpack with that, and we have a couple of other slides to talk about. But talking a little bit about your classical education and how you really started. Your father had a great library. You were really interested. You had this really nice relationship with Douglas Flam from, Ursus Books in New York, and really educating yourself and understanding and becoming classically trained sort of led you to have an appreciation on various different things. But it really started with Duchamp. And do you want to talk a little bit about, why Duchamp was so important to you?
Yeah, Marcel Duchamp was a French artist, and we'll show a picture later. I always think that Duchamp brought conceptualism over the ocean to North America, and Hans Hofmann, who we may talk about, brought color theory over the ocean. And these are two of the artists that I think are really pillars in the whole, volumes of history in the last at least 100 years. And, if you ask many young artists who they might be more influenced by, Picasso, which everybody knows, or Duchamp. Almost all the young artists I talk to say Duchamp for sure. Although we all know Picasso, if you had to pick one artist that was the most famous perhaps. And he really was such an intellect and really started his career. And in computer science, there's a thing called recursive programming, where you write code and it calls itself and it goes through, and then it calls itself and it goes through. And he did that through his whole career. So even the final pieces that he made in his career were referenced at the very beginning of his career. It's almost like he had a blueprint for what he was going to do throughout his life. And he was friends with all of these artists like Picabia, and Gertrude Stein was a great collector. And there was always a quote when I think Duchamp passed away first, and they asked Picasso, and he said, he was wrong. I think that was the battle. And on Duchamp's gravestone, it said, "It's always the other guy."
I love it.
Like he was always a punster. It was always tongue in cheek. It was always, always had to go for the laugh.
Yeah.
But every time I think of him as an artist and his practice, it really informs so many other contemporary artists and younger artists with appropriation and things like that. It's
appropriation, replication, duplication. We've talked a lot about that. Yeah. And also one of the themes that you've talked about in that you've developed in your collection is also this this theme of time. And I think it brought you specifically to an interest in Ankara. And the picture that we have of you is actually standing with the Ankara. And I thought that we could talk a little bit about, that concept, because that's an important, the concept of time is a very important part of your collection too.
Well, it is. I mean, there's another piece I have of Ankara, who was a Japanese conceptual artist, and there were telegrams. No one sends those anymore. They have, we send texts or whatever. I don't think my kids use email anymore. It's all texting. And what happens is he would send these telegrams from around the world, wherever he was, to certain people and just say, "I am still alive, Ankara." That's all it said. And it's so poignant because, on a personal note, a good friend of mine this week just had a heart attack. He was only 61. Thank God he's fine. He went home from the hospital today. But, we're here for a finite amount of time. And this painting is not even in the main part of our house. It's sort of upstairs. If I go, out of the house early, it's perhaps the first thing I see in the morning. And we'll talk about that in a sec. And then when I get home and put the kids to bed, they're getting a little bit older now, but put the alarm on, that was the last thing I would see at the end of the day. And people come to the house sometimes and say, "Oh, is that the day your house was born or built?" And it really, it's meant to be an anonymous day. It's 24 hours. What are you going to do that's good for your family, that's good for your partner or spouse, that's good for your children, that's good for your community, even what's good for you? Like, you have 24 hours, don't waste it. And it's not a specific date. It's just a day. It's just 24 hours. And people ask sometimes, what's your favorite piece? That's my favorite piece. Because every day it reminds me that, we're here for a certain countable number of hours, days, minutes, and you have to do the right thing, right? You have to have a fulfilling existence. And this painting is always the touchstone for me of what can happen during that 24 hours. So.
Carpe diem.
Carpe diem, seize the day.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, great. So I want to get to a couple of stories of how you built your collection and how you journeyed through, a couple of favorite moments and some very important pieces that became a counterstone or a theme in your collection. And obviously, the Ankara is important. And we touched upon Hans Hofmann a second ago, but I thought this might be interesting to sort of talk a little bit more about. Obviously, the concept of color theorists, and that was very important. Do you want to speak a little bit about how you became interested in Hans Hofmann?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this painting is from 1959, and there was a very amazing collector in Toronto who's since passed away, and I think there were personal things going on, and some of the pieces were for sale at one of the galleries in Toronto, and I was a young guy, and I walked in, and I stood in front of this painting, and I was sort of paralyzed. Just the way it impacted me. And here's a guy who was a great teacher. He comes over the ocean, as we said. He's having influence on major artists that we all know now. And then he kind of retires from teaching. And this painting he did when he was 79 or 80. And just so you think you can't do things later in life, his energy and his creative capacity just exploded right at this time. And he was very well known for writing essays on what we call push-pull color theory. And he would put certain colors adjacent to other colors and it would kind of have a bit different tension depending on where the colors were placed on the canvas. And this painting has everything in it. And for example, the reason this painting is important to me is that when I walk around art fairs or galleries or even museums for that matter, I wait, for me personally, for that feeling that I have when I stand in front of this painting, where it just kicks me in the gut and I go, wow, I can't get that out of my head.
Yeah, you can't, it's just, you couldn't live without it now.
That's nailed to the wall for the most part. It just came back from it was borrowed for some exhibitions, but it's a very important piece for me.
Yep.
And I used to sit and read these essays by Hans Hofmann, lying in bed because it was in our bedroom, and read those and just look at the painting and try to understand what his writings were about. But he was a master, of course.
And in our discussions leading up to this, we've talked a lot about how you want to live with the art, or how you want to, how important it is to have those moments of reflection, or, it hits you in the gut, you want to live with it. And we've talked a little bit about how there is an interest to hang things together in your home and a conversation between certain pictures. Whether or not they're a conversation that only you know about, or whether it's visual, it's a visual connection with something, or how it is that you've envisioned this conversation almost between them.
Yeah, I think there's a picture at the end with some gifts we just made. But I always like the communication or dialogue, so to speak, between the historic works or artists of yesteryear and younger artists who are doing things now.
Yeah.
I like to hang those things in juxtaposition because there is a communication, there is a dialogue.
Yeah.
And I always say, if you look back at, I'm a orthopedic surgeon, but if you look back at what they did in medicine 50 years from now, you might say, well, that's pretty barbaric. But to be so arrogant and not humbled, and to think that they won't say that about us in 50 years from now, of course they will.
Yeah.
And I think that great artists somehow march a couple steps ahead of most of the rest of us. And I use that sometimes in my research at the university to think, well, why wait 50 years? What can we do now that might, advance that time frame? And when I stand, these are great enhancers.
Yeah.
I went for a very beautiful dinner last night with some friends, and we had some nice wine. And I would say, sometimes if you have a beautiful meal, and I'm not a big drinker, but if you have a one glass of wine, it really enhances the meal. And I think
definitely believe in that.
The analogy is really, I think art enhances our lives.
Yep. And talking a little bit about, the concept of these, I'm showing now the Stanley Whitney. I don't know if you could see that.
Okay.
And, there's a theme, obviously, a very musical theme between these two works as well, but the concept of, that there are themes that come, and sort of the interesting juxtaposition of having these artists as well in your collection.
Well, this is a phenomenal painting.
Yeah.
And you can almost see what I was speaking of, but not doing great justice to, how certain patches of colors have been applied by the artist, and there's this sort of tension or resolution if they're closer or far apart. And this painting is called Purple Haze, which, if you that might be rock historians, is a very famous song by Jimi Hendrix. And I play in a band. That's one.
You're a guitarist.
A guitarist, Jimi Hendrix. Actually, one of the nurses in surgery So I just remember this story.
Yeah.
She every year in Rolling Stone magazine or they always the top 100 guitar players of all times, and every year it's always Jimi Hendrix #1 every year. And I took a vote in surgery in the operating room. Who do you think the #1 guitar player of all time was? And this lady was a bit short. She's retired now. She goes, "I was Jimi Hendrix." I go, well, I said, there perhaps was some discussion that if he lived longer, he was only 27, that maybe he wouldn't have been considered so great, but he passed away at 27, tragically. And she goes, no, it was Hendrix. I go, how can you be so sure? She goes, well, I saw Hendrix play 3 times. I go, what? Where did you see Jimi Hendrix play? She goes, in Montreal and in New York and at Woodstock. I go, oh
Amazing.
my God.
Amazing.
I go, if you saw Hendrix play 3 times and you were at Woodstock, I'm not even eligible to vote.
I'm not worthy. I'm not
like,
worthy.
I'm not worthy. Like, you win.
I
right?
love it.
So,
do you ever play music in your surgery?
we used to play the radio, stereo or Spotify or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So the reason we put these next to each other is, you've talked a little bit about, riff back to the Hans Hofmann with this particular, with this particular work, and how that's, it's just so interesting to think of the different connections that many of these artists have had, not only, to you, but also, art historically as well.
Well, it's interesting, like, when I showed my wife the picture of this, because I was very fortunate to get it in Basel, Switzerland, the art fair. And I showed my wife the picture, and she goes, oh, I love that. As soon as it gets here, can we put it up? I go, well, you've never asked me to put anything up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course, and it's in our dining room.
I love it.
Next to the piano and guitars and stuff. So,
yeah.
But it just makes you feel good, Sometimes people say, well, I have to buy this piece of art because it's very difficult. And I said, well, I don't really need guts on my mantelpiece.
Yeah.
Like when I come home from work, you come home, it's your sanctum sanctorum. You just want to decompress, right?
Yeah.
And when I stand in front of this painting, almost every day I'm at home, it just makes me smile. It makes me feel good. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you bought this at Basel in Switzerland, but also that you're saying, that, there can be a simple pleasure that you get from this kind of work that you live with. But you also do have a very intellectual focus to your collection. And speaking a little bit about, where you go and how you acquire works, we had a conversation about Malevich that you bought in Basel. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, this is another artist who is a pillar, like Hoffman, like Duchamp, constructivism, and so forth. And one time I was at the fair a number of years ago. I don't even know how long. And I was in Basel, Switzerland, at the fair. Upstairs is all the contemporary galleries, and downstairs are the more classic galleries.
Yeah.
And upstairs, I couldn't really make sense of the prices of some of the things. And so I said, without knowing I was going to look at anything, that I would go downstairs and let's just see what survived 50 years or 75 years or 100 years.
Yeah.
And I wasn't looking for anything. And then I don't think we have a picture of it, but I stood in front of this drawing of Malevich from 1915. Very small drawing. And again, I was paralyzed.
Yeah.
And I went back to see it about 3 times. And I asked the gallery person if they could, I could ask questions or they could educate me about it. And ultimately, I ended up acquiring that drawing. And so again, these are the pillars, mm-hmm. the foundation. It's a very solid foundation of this historic material. Mm-hmm. But then sometimes I like to take a flyer on a young artist, like this young guy who I think is really great.
Yeah. You say that you have a very atypical walk through the art world, and with that, what's interesting is that you've developed relationships with dealers, with curators, with so many people, art auction people, to really to build your collection and to understand things around you. And I think, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly, it's a whole ecosystem, art. the art world. I would say, like, galleries have a tough job because they have to champion a young artist, let's say, and guide them through the journey. And curators, they go around and see a bunch of things, and I always liken it to, they have to decide which basket they're going to pluck out of the Nile, and save, and promote that artist in a way, or give them opportunity with a show, so they can be seen. And then I think the collector kind of has the easiest job, because you could be the proverbial tire kicker and go around and look things and say no, yes, maybe. And the artist, to me, has the hardest job, because the artist is putting themselves out there to be critiqued, to be enjoyed or not enjoyed.
Yep.
It's a tough road.
Yep.
It's not. And so, given that, I have great respect for artists that have stick-with-itness and progress. And sometimes an artist, I might say, I'm looking at something, I go, this is really good, but the cake isn't quite baked yet. And I'll keep an eye on them and come back and see their next round or round thereafter. And something will click, and I'll go, okay, they got it going on.
Yeah.
We're here.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I meet the artists, it could be a great enhancer, of, and you talk about collecting, I think there's great mentors of mine said that there's a balance between academic or intellect and intuition. You may, in your mind, wander through why something is maybe important or strikes the chord. But then at the end of the day, you have to stand in front of that and just go, wow.
You talk about the titration between those two things. That's incredibly important.
That's like an organic chemistry thing.
Yeah, I had to learn about that for this.
Nice titrations. Thank you very much. So, it is a sort of a balance, and the first step is just going to see things.
Yeah.
Looking through books, going around here, trying to see as much as you can, ask questions.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to ask them to send you information, and learning and ask, and just sort of being brought up to speed. And then at the end of the day, you have to decide, do I really respond to that?
Yeah.
Do I want to live with that?
Is it the kick in the gut? Is it
the kick in the gut? But that's hard to come by.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not so easy, and it gets harder with time. But I think when you trust yourself a little bit more and you set the bar at a certain level, it allows you to say no to a lot of things. And then you wait for that feeling to get you over the bar.
Yep.
And I wait for that now. But I like to take chances. It's, for some of you might know, I asked a senior European collector one time, when you're finished collecting. And they told me when you're using a Giacometti sculpture as a doorstop, you're getting close to the end. It's like, and
or when one of your favorite pictures is still sitting in a crate, and you haven't been able to put it back in the place that you were intentionally had it.
Yes, well, that will happen.
Right? That'll happen at some point.
Yes, it will go
if
back.
It hasn't already.
It will go back.
So one of the questions for, that is obviously the most obvious question that people would want to talk to a collector and say, what was the first thing you ever acquired? And I think in talking with you and understanding a little bit about that, what I found so interesting was that you really wanted to find out about the artist himself and learn a little bit more about that. Do you want to just talk generally about that? You don't have to talk about the fair that you bought it at. I mean, it's interesting, but, to understand the importance of the artist is what we're talking about. And
I think I was quite young. There was that art fair at the city hall. I was just walking around. It was a very humid day.
Yeah.
It was very uncomfortable to look at art, outside. But I saw this painting that I really liked, and I was a student, and there was someone lying in front of it on the grass eating French fries or something. but I really liked it. And the artist said, why don't you come to my studio, which was out in Elora near Guelph. It was an old schoolhouse. And so I drove out there one day and looked at his paintings, and I bought that painting, which is still in one of my daughter's bedrooms. And yeah, it was beautiful. It just responded to it somehow. And sort of started like that, But again, it was just looking and thinking about things and sort of discerning what you like and what you don't like.
So when you're talking to collectors that consider themselves at the beginning of their collecting journey, or they're just starting to build a collection, obviously, doing your research and really becoming entranced by understanding everything there is about, the artist, getting their catalogue raisonné, doing your research, like that's so important about it, and the gut punch. Is there any other advice you'd give to somebody that is, that's thinking about what to add or even maybe what to take out of their collection?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said a couple of times, you just have to look.
Yeah.
And my job after this is looking after the Raptors. We have a game tonight. So
we'll get you out just in time.
I got to go from here to the arena. But there are a number of players over time have come up to me and said, "Hey, Doc, someone told me I'm supposed to talk to you about art."
Yeah.
So I bought them art books.
I love this story. This is what I was hoping you were going to tell us about.
And it's funny because sometimes they'll leave the team and they'll be coaches or senior players coming back to Toronto. And they go, "Doc, remember you bought me those art books?" I go, "Yeah." They go, "I'm collecting art now." And some of them have funds to do that, actually. That's great. And we've been on the road. I've taken some of the team people and some family members of the players. We were at, San Francisco at SF MoMA.
Yeah. And
I took them over to give them a tour. And I said, "Look, I can't show you everything, but I picked, 8 or 10 things." And we started in the first room, and I said, one of the big mistakes in the art world, museum world, is they didn't collect artists of diversity, and they didn't collect women artists. There's a big gap. And I showed them at the time, talk about the auctions, San Francisco had 2 Mark Rothko paintings. And they decided to deaccession or sell one, for which I think they raised $60 million. And why did they do that? To get money to fix the problem. And then I said, "Let's go look upstairs." And, I think that it is really important that there is representation of different artists. And, sometimes you hear, "Oh, that's an LGBT plus artist," or "That's a female artist," or "That's a they artist," or "It's a, black artist," or "purple artist," or whatever. But I hope at some point in the future, in my kind of dream, that you just say, "That's a great artist." Isn't that a great piece of art? And that they don't have to be cataloged somehow by their diversity or background or whatever it is. Now, of course, different communities have important stories that need to be told about their experience, and I'm respectful of that. But I think that if it could ever get to a point where you just say, "I really responded to that, and that's a great piece of art," I really think that should be the goal of all of this.
This is a nice segue, not only from you being, taking the opportunity to really talk to somebody, the team, about art, and I love the idea of you putting a book in their hand first to study and to learn a little bit about this first. But you've also been very generous in your donations, and you're involved on the acquisition committee at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art, and you have, donated these works that are here as well. And I thought that was a sort of a nice segue to be able to talk about this.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, talk about the Art Toronto. So the sculpture in the foreground is an artist who was originally from London, Ontario, but now has a studio down in Brooklyn. Her name is Esma Mohammed. I think her parents were Egyptian, and she grew up in London. It was a bit tough as a kid who was from that background. And she made this sculpture because the things at the bottom are all shea nuts, and shea butter is used for hair products and things like that. And she made these busts of these young girls that were harvesting these nuts, and all the reproductions of them are on the floor, on the plinth. And the painting in the back is an American artist, Esteban Jefferson, who I think is another great painter, artist. But the project, if you look at that, is that he did these paintings of Petit Palais in Paris. And in the lobby of that museum, they had 2 busts of black individuals. They didn't have any names. They weren't famous people. In fact, he wrote a whole letter trying to understand who these people were. He wrote to the museum. But they're just sitting in the lobby where you buy your tickets to get in the museum. And the French lady who's there is on her cell phone. And she's not even looking at these pieces. Like, it's almost like they're nondescript. They're not important. What worth do they have? I'm going in to see the real art. And I sort of thought in my mind, when I acquired both these pieces, slightly different times, that they could go together. That was almost my amateur curatorial approach. And they just installed this in Montreal. I was there a couple weeks ago for the public to enjoy. And here are 2 great young artists, but the conversation between them, I thought, what a great painting to have at that museum that could start the discussion about how certain members of community have been ignored. And so I'm pretty proud of that. And I do think, my wife and I, we have 5 kids, all doing different things, but my wife, Shauna, we always say that probably our most important job or responsibility is to teach our children that we're very blessed and that we do have obligations and responsibilities to the community. And there's lots of ways that you could fulfill that, perhaps. And one of them is to donate art. And so that can be enjoyed for generations. And so I think about that sometimes if I'm seeing a work at a gallery or art fair, etc. Could this be good enough for a museum? Would it be good enough for this particular museum or a university museum or a smaller institution, so that it would be seen, not just hidden in the back in storage. And I'm very grateful that they put these pieces in, they installed them.
And we've talked about how, for you, so much of, investing in this sort of discourse is also the advice or, the need for addressing tough questions. Like, this is, it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to put these 2 together and to be able to have this as, a conversation piece and something that you're, actively working on with the museum now.
Well, it should be educational. I mean, if students are brought to a museum, that the art can be used as an educational vehicle in a way to instruct the children of the next generation so that they know how to treat people. I mean, what's the humanity of it all? And so I think it can play a very important role. And I'm just happy to participate with that.
What I've enjoyed speaking with you about is the fact that you really are, you're the person that's really putting your collection together. And it is, you're not necessarily working with anybody in particular. It's really your eye and what you're looking at. But you also advise and, have been advised by and appreciate the mentorship that many people have given you along the way. And there was a collector that you mentioned to me who's based in Chicago who gave you some interesting advice about being daring or, buying something that is, buy something on the edge.
Yeah, I actually was a Toronto person.
Is it?
Who I think is 100 now. Thank God she's still alive. And I just saw a very good friend of hers out here who's doing quite well at the art fair. And I used to go to the fair in Chicago when I was younger.
Oh, so maybe it was in
And
Chicago.
every morning we'd go for breakfast. This nice lady, her name's Jeannie Parkin. She's a great person. And Jeannie would say to me, "You have to buy something on the edge. Take a chance." Right? And I always remember that.
Yeah.
And I did take a chance on some things. And I think you have to ask questions, there are some people, there are very good art advisors around.
Yeah.
And sometimes they do help track things down because I'm quite busy. And so it can be like a team effort. Like you can find different people who will help you.
Yeah.
And I think at the beginning, sometimes it might be wise for someone to engage with someone who has some extra knowledge.
Yeah.
To say, that's really great. I remember going to the Uptown Armory Fair in New York, and there was a great dealer back then. And I would go around my first round, and then I go back with him later and show him certain things I thought were interesting, and he'd say, that's a great artist, but that's not a very good example. Or that's a great piece, but that artist, we don't know what's going to happen yet. Price is a little bit high. But every time you go through an iteration, you can up your acuity, let's say, and you get better at it. I would hope. I mean, everyone says they didn't make a mistake at some point, but what is the mistake, right?
Right.
Someone showed me something at their house last week that I don't know what they're going to do with it, but they makes them feel really good.
Yeah.
Go, okay.
Yeah.
As long as you didn't sell sometimes I feel like say my wife would go, "You sold the cow for a bag of beans? Like, what were you thinking about? The kids need to drink milk," right? It's like, I was like, and so, everybody has their limits of things, of what you are willing to acquire and how much money it costs. And I think when things reach a certain price, which it's a lot different now than it was when I started, that you have to be savvy,
And nice. Being a nice Canadian really helps.
Well, I think being a nice Canadian helps. It's like,
Right? We've talked about the fact that the art world is this relationship business.
I have to be careful because my mom was from Philadelphia.
I know.
But sometimes you travel around and people think you're American, I might say, and I can say that in the context of this room. I don't know. I haven't checked everyone's passports. And then when they find out you're Canadian, they go, "Oh, yeah, come in." You want a drink?
Right?
And people have been very nice to me.
Yeah.
Because sometimes in this business, someone has to be willing to allow you to buy.
Yeah.
Like that Stanley Whitney painting.
Yeah.
Very hard to come by now.
Yeah.
They were at the time also. But someone has to, I wouldn't say take pity on you, but they just have to say, "Okay, you're nice enough, we'll let you take a chance. We'll take a chance on you." But part of that is, I think, knowing that if someone's not a speculator. So you're not going to buy it and flip it, because that drives the gallerists crazy when they see things that come up at auction, I must say. And after a certain amount of time, you're allowed, but not 6 months later.
No. 2 months later.
That's
not a good
That's
idea.
not really golf club etiquette.
No.
And there's times, very few times I've wanted to deaccession or sell something, not very many times. But I always go back to the same gallery and say, "Do you want to work with this?" Because that's the right thing to do. And so...
But there's where the nice Canadian thing comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we are kind of nice.
I know, we try.
We say sorry a lot.
Exactly.
But anyways, I'm not really sorry, but it's...
I think we've got a few minutes to be able to ask them questions if there's anybody in the audience that wants a question. Yes, we're getting a microphone for you. No? Okay. You're a kid. You're allowed a question just because you're a kid. It's okay. So I think in these, when we're talking about the fact that there is protocol and there's the right way to go about working and living in this ecosystem that is the art world, and how, we might have, I might have some things, or somebody might have some things to show you, and there's, an understanding and a network that you build around yourself to be able to understand. You're right, you're a busy guy, you've got lots of other things on the go, but it's nice to know that there are going to be people that are looking out for you, and that you're having the opportunity to go to some of these art fairs and to be able to look at things. And that probably is very good advice to give to somebody as well, that is, at the beginning of their journey, is find the people that you trust, understand the network, understand the community around you.
Yeah, I mean, there are all factors. I was at my clinic Wednesday, and if someone's being booked for a surgery, I might say to them, look, it's a team effort.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the right surgeon, you have to have the right therapist, you have to have the right patient. Everybody has to do their job. If someone drops the ball, it's going to be a terrible result. And I would say the same thing here, with the proviso that based on whatever the cost of something is, if you have the funds and you love something, then people can throw caution to the wind and take a chance. I've taken chances on things.
But equally, can you think of a work that got away, that you didn't take the chance and you regret that you didn't at the time?
Besides, like the Mona Lisa or something. Damn, I really wish I had got.
Yeah, come on, there has to be something.
Well, there's always pieces that you say. Sometimes it was, people will say, "Oh, I could have bought that. I saw it at the art fair, whatever," and it turns out to be Warhol or something. Well, I always have a gradation of commitment to something. Like, did you just see that at the art fair with 20,000 other things, or did you actually go talk to someone about the piece? Did you put a reserve on it? Let me go think about it for 2 hours. Did you actually give a deposit to keep the piece? Did you buy it and sell it too early? There's all these things. And so, no, you couldn't have just bought it.
Yeah, but they're not going to necessarily share all that information with you.
No, but if someone's honest, they'll just tell you, look, I missed the chance, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't get it.
Yeah.
And then the prices. Someone once told me this year's highs are next year's lows for the great works.
Yeah.
That happens, but not for everything. And that's why you do keep an eye on things for a while and say, well, what survived? Did it survive 5 years even? Where's that artist now? And did you take a chance, or you just like it so much? Who cares? Just keep it. I told my wife not to sell anything in a garage sale, so she might be pleasantly surprised. But she knows not to do that.
And your son is studying architecture right now in the States.
Yeah, no, my middle son, Rory, is doing his master's. He did his architecture at University of Toronto, and then now he's in the master's program at Harvard. And he came home from school in first year in Toronto, and he said, Dad, we had a lecture on art history. And then he said, we have some of these artists in our house. it's like, okay. Now we got some things to talk about, buddy. It's like,
talk about this. I love this story. Tell them what you said to him. You said, write an artist about, write an essay about these three particular
I gave him
works.
3 books. I said, here, take these 3 books and go write an essay, and your professors will be freaked out. They'll have no idea how you put that all together. But like for me, it's funny because sometimes I meet someone in the art world, and they go, "Oh, are you in the art world?
Yeah.
Like, do you work at a gallery or a museum or something?" I go, "Actually, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but that's the biggest compliment you could ever pay me." It's like,
right. Exactly.
So it's that's fun.
Yeah, that's nice. Any questions? Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, one sec. We're just about to get you a microphone.
You're a steward of a significant collection. You have 5 children, and you've donated works to museums. Do you have a strategy in dealing with the collection that you're a steward for, and how does the family and how do museums fit into that?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. Maybe we could go for dinner, and you could tell me what I should do. I keep trying to, I wouldn't say strategize, but my older daughter is now, she just passed her Canadian medical exams and U.S. medical exams, but she wants to be a surgeon. Go figure that out.
Yeah.
But I used to take her to Miami Basel with me.
I love it.
And one of my friends who was in the art world in Toronto is a great guy. And I told him that years ago, and he said, well, wow, you should give her a budget. I go, Johnny, that's a great idea, man. So I said, okay, well, here's $1,000 or something, right? So it was hard to find that at the main fair, but except for a book. So we went to some of the smaller fairs, Aqua and Nata, things like that. And she picked this beautiful drawing of this Canadian artist. And I said to the gallerist, who's actually out here, first-time collector piece, $1,000 tax in. So he goes, sure. And then I saw one of the curators from the National Gallery of Canada later, and I told her the story. And she said, you know, the National Gallery is looking at buying work by that artist right now.
Unbelievable.
I said, well, that's a pretty good day for a 12-year-old when they scoop the National Gallery curator. So apropos to your question, the children have started to become more interested, and I've tried to share that with them so they have increasing knowledge. They've grown up with things. So there are specific things that I have in storage in crates for quite some time now that I bought for Canada. I wanted them to be for Canada. And I will make sure at an appropriate time that they get gifted to specific institutions. And I've been thinking more recently that should be across the country. We're too small a country. Like, all these different museums can't buy a work by all of these different artists sometimes. They have to work in concert with each other and be, friendly and cooperative, and know that piece exists in Vancouver, let's say, and we need to borrow it for a show in Ottawa. But I think that, that I've thought about those things quite a bit, and what, the family would maintain as a core group. And there's certain themes that you were mentioning earlier. Artists of diversity I've been very interested in that tell a story. And that would end up at some place that could be consequential and educational and that sort of thing. But I'm working through that now, trying to get everything cataloged. I'm trying to identify things that should be maintained, at least for the rest of my life, but that the kids know what to do. And I always say, like, you can tell your kids to do certain things, and they're all good kids, very blessed that way. But if you don't show them by example to do certain things, that they won't know. They say, oh, my dad was just a big talker. But if they see the example and they've seen the cycle of doing that I think that's something they can give back to the country or community or the city or. But I'm thinking quite deeply about that right now. We were talking about another big collector in the United States who passed away sadly, and a lot of the work just went to auction. The building got bought by the museum next door, and that family could have kept that collection together, and it really would have been very, I think, consequential, because it was a great collection. But it just kind of gets dissipated around the world. But that's a personal decision. Like, you can't speak for other people.
Yeah. And it's also hard that, not everything can always go to an institution. You have to develop those relationships, understand what that's about. And sometimes it's, there are different ways to be able to think about what the next steps of something like that are. Who are the next custodians of this collection?
Yeah, I think that's a key word. I view it as, in a way, being custodial. That I'm charged with protecting these things. Like, if I buy something and it's coming from New York or LA or London, England, or whatever it might be, I always have crates made for them so they're protected. And many things get borrowed. And I just like to be respectful to the work and to the artist. and most most of the artists I know personally know that they're welcome to borrow anything for a show that might come up for them. Like I make it available, but that the art is carefully custodial and it's taken care of and respected, as it should be. Yeah.
Any other questions at all? Yes.
I'm wondering. One second.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi. I just wonder if you could comment on the state of the gallery business system scene in Toronto and Canada in general. What do you think we should add, subtract, what the city could do, how things could be done collectively or individually, that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I might have some ideas, maybe not have all the answers, but look, as I said earlier, I have great respect for the gallerists that have to support the artists and they have to guide them and they may get a portfolio every day from different artists that are all trying to crack the code. I think the artists are reliant on those different galleries to help get them blasted into the world somehow, that they introduce the curators to their work and provide them with information. And that's a gallerist's job. I think it's part of their job. But it's tough. It's expensive. And, I think getting out of Canada is a small place. We have a lot of land, but it's a small place. And I think having communication with other people in the art world outside of Canada is important. It's important here also to know the curators and other colleagues that might be involved in the art world. And something it could be some cohesion between gallerists, like say, okay, fine, let's share this artist, or let's get this program going
Together.
and split the costs, because those things become prohibitive. Like I'm appreciative of that. But I think people have to be willing to take a leap outside. You have to color outside the lines sometimes. Although I did see a New Yorker cartoon one time with these two scientists in a box with all this writing on the inside. And it says, I've done some of my best thinking inside the box. Right? Which is, sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Is there another question over here I just saw? Yes.
Thank you very much. You mentioned pricing on two different occasions. How would you advise the up-and-coming artist about the price of his or her?
The last part
How would you advise an artist when you come up as a collector and you see a painting that goes really wow, and the price of the painting? How does that influence your decision?
Yeah, I think, look, it's, what do they say, even Bill Gates wants an extra $100 at the end of the month to pay his telephone bill. Probably not realistic, but, for someone, I don't think we had that slide, or did we? Let's put this up here. So this is an artist, Daniel Olson. I think he's in Montreal. And I bought this piece for $25. I think it cost me $100 to frame it. Right? It's one of my favorite pieces. It's just so perfect.
Yeah.
He's a great conceptualist. And you think about the whole universe, whatever that might be, but the space in that box is really in that box. It can't be anywhere else.
Yeah.
And I use that as an example of sometimes you find something that's really quite reasonable. I think most people could probably scrounge together $25. But I love that piece, right? Because it doesn't always have to be expensive. How artists price their things, or the galleries guide them to what things should be priced at, I don't know if I have a complete handle on that sometimes. Like I'll hear prices sometimes and I'll go, wow, how'd you come up with that? Like, I like this piece and the artist seems quite promising and up and coming, and I just can't make sense of that. And then it becomes a relative thing, right? Because it's, most people have finite funds. to spend on things. And but then somebody just wander around and you might find the $25 piece and just go, wow, that's great. So it's a complex. You were asking about the ecosystem and the galleries, and everyone plays their part, as we said. However, there is an interaction between all these things. And I don't think that a gallery wants to raise a price for an artist so dramatically that might hurt their career, actually, because they get priced out of the game. So it has to be a slow, steady, and then a curator gets interested and they get a show, maybe they get a book. I mean, there's a whole trajectory of what happens, right? You gotta walk, then run.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring this up as our last slide because I thought it really is very, we talked about this before, and I love the idea that this is really a titration between intellect and intuition. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with money.
No, it's what we sort of talked about for an hour now. It's like, but I think it all comes down to finding things that you like or enjoy or can live with, and then each person with their own sort of resources has to decide what they can do. Right? Sometimes it just makes it really easy for me. I just tell gallerists I'm not an oligarch. It's like all my assets are unfrozen and I'm not an oligarch. I can't make sense of that. Can't sell the cow for that one.
No.
So.
Well, this has been an enjoyable hour. Thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you so much.